Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to lesson 11a. We're going to be talking about imperialism during this lesson and looking at how Western European nations started taking over the rest of the world and utilizing them for not only their natural resources but also their strategic positions around the world. So your reading for this particular lesson is going to be chapter 21, the first half of chapter 21, on imperialism, pages 647 to 660. In those pages, you're going to find a few new terms: imperialism, indigenous, and viceroy. Be looking for what those might mean. So let's talk a little bit about imperialism. We talked certainly about exploration, the idea that European nations early on, way back in the 15 and 1600s, were working their way around the world, trying to figure out what was what and understanding the geography of our planet. Imperialism denotes the idea of taking over places, and as the slide indicates, Western nations began to look to other parts of the world, Asia and Africa in particular, as a source of new raw materials. Also, there was a desire to have political and economic control of those nations, and strategic and religious concerns were also important. The idea of militaristically, there might be an important place in the world that a country wanted to have a base, so they would take that over. And religiously, the idea of taking Christianity and giving it to other individuals around the world was a huge push for imperialism. One of the ways that it was justified or made to sound like it was appropriate for white Europeans to take over oftentimes other races were based on three main factors. One was it was a desire to help the, quote, uncivilized, unquote, people, those folks that weren't like Europeans, to bring them up to the European standards. There was a desire to spread Christianity, and the idea, as we talked about before, of social Darwinism. The might makes right, and the most powerful should take over. So those were ways that the Europeans justified their often very racist ways of dealing with people around the world. The critics of imperialism certainly charged the Europeans and eventually American imperialists with using a double standard. So they would fight for freedom and human rights at home, but in the colonial possessions, they were not expecting that to occur. So a little bit of a double standard going on. What happens in Asia? Well, Asia between about 1800 and 1900 is carved up by the Western powers. Great Britain takes colonies in Singapore, Burma, and India. France develops colonies in Indochina, the area that is now today Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia. And the U.S. even takes control in the late 1800s of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. So even the U.S. gets into the game of colonization and imperialism. What was going on in terms of the political systems? Well, there were different methods that were used. Some were indirect, where the home country would work through local leaders. They would buy or control the local leaders, who would then take the Europeans' desires and put it into the country. There was also direct rule, where the local leaders were replaced with officials from the original nation. So the English would bring English people to run India, for example. The political rights of the local people varied by the colony, but rarely were the political rights of the imperial country the same as those of the mother country. There was a lot of resistance to colonialism in Asia. Lots of people did not like the idea of colonial rulers taking over their country, and we had revolts throughout Asia. Economic and religious issues were the main focus of the resistance. Generally, nationalism was not a focus of the resistance. Colonialism in Africa was significant, and really the limit, as we saw early on, was to the coasts of Africa for European involvement. It was hard for them to penetrate into the interior of Africa because of either the deserts in the north or the jungles in the middle part of the country. But by the time the 1880s to 1900s roll around, all of Africa is carved up. It's carved up for a number of reasons: raw materials, strategic lands, and a desire for prestige. If you were a powerful European nation, you had to have some colonies, and Africa was one of the last places to carve up. So lots of nations took those over. Africans attempted to resist colonization, but the Europeans were much more powerful militarily. And a perfect example is the Sudanese, who in 1898 tried to revolt against the British. The Sudanese lost 11,000. The British lost 28. So you can see a massive difference in terms of technology related to military. If we move a little further south into Africa, into the current nation of South Africa, we see kind of a different colonial system, and that is that the Boers, or what was later called the Afrikaners, and the British desired control of this southern area of Africa. And they fought the Boer War from 1899 to 1902. So the Boers, which were originally Dutch settlers, fighting the British, the more recent settlers. Kind of an interesting situation. The original and native people of the area, called the Zulu, resisted colonialism and often had a number of fights against both the Boers and the British. And in 1910, British creates an independent nation. Britain created an independent nation in South Africa. So South Africa was one of the very first nations in Africa to become independent. We also see a rise of African nationalism happening. Most Africans did not like the idea of being controlled by people that were totally different than them from a long way away, and oftentimes resisted. And native Africans, people that had grown up in Africa, that were indigenous to Africa, rarely had a hand in governing their nations. So new organizations started to spring up in the early 1900s that were devoted to African nationalism, trying to figure out ways to govern Africa by Africans. So that's a little bit of information about what we were talking about related to imperialism, specifically in Asia and Africa. We're going to go ahead and move on to study imperialism a little bit more in lesson 11b. Before we do that, go ahead and finish up your assignment, and we'll talk next time.